What we're watching right now between Canada and Donald Trump isn't just another Twitter feud or a one-day headline. It is a slow, deliberate, calculated response from an entire country that has decided it is not going to sit quietly while Trump and the MAGA movement threaten its economy, its democracy, and its security. Canada is angry, but more importantly, Canada is organized. And the way Ottawa is pushing back right now, diplomatically, economically, and politically, is a dagger aimed straight at the heart of Trump's leverage over U.S. allies. Today, I want to walk through what Trump and his allies are threatening to do to Canada, how the Canadian government and Canadian society are hitting back, and why this time the consequences for Trumpism could be far more serious than people in his orbit want to admit. Let's break this down. First, we need to remind ourselves what the Trump-Canada clash actually looks like when he has power, because we've seen this movie before. When Trump was president, he slapped so-called national security tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. He treated one of America's closest allies like an enemy state. He went to the G7 summit in Quebec in 2018, signed a joint communique, got on Air Force One, and then, from the plane, blew it all up. He rage-tweeted at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He called him weak. One of Trump's top advisors went on TV and snarled that there's a special place in hell for a leader like Trudeau, who, in their view, dared to stand up for his country. Canada's response then was a preview of what we're seeing again now. Ottawa didn't just complain. They matched those tariffs, dollar for dollar. They targeted iconic American products, many of them coming from states that were politically important to Trump. They sent a very clear message. Canada might be smaller than the United States, but it will not be pushed around. And ordinary Canadians reacted too. You had Canadian shoppers openly talking about avoiding U.S. products. Local media ran segments on how to swap American brands for Canadian ones. It wasn't some formal government boycott, but there was a real grassroots backlash driven by anger that a U.S. president would use national security as a pretext to attack Canada. That episode matters because it showed two things. Trump is perfectly willing to weaponize trade and humiliate allies, and Canada is perfectly willing to hit back hard when it has to. Now fast forward to today, with Trump leading the Republican field again and openly threatening a second term that would be even more extreme. Over the last year, Trump has promised sweeping tariffs. He talks about a universal 10% tariff on all imports and even higher tariffs on countries he accuses of cheating the United States. He has floated the idea of walking away from NATO commitments if allies don't hit his preferred defense spending target on his timeline. He has praised authoritarian leaders, attacked democratic institutions, and made it very clear: if he returns to the White House, the old assumptions about U.S. reliability are gone, and Canada has noticed. In early 2024, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister gave an unusually blunt interview. She didn't endorse or oppose any candidate, but she made it clear that Ottawa is actively preparing for what she called a worst-case scenario in the United States. She talked about protecting Canadian democracy from foreign interference, shielding Canada's economy from sudden, arbitrary tariffs, and making sure Canada can defend itself and its allies, even if Washington becomes unpredictable again. That is diplomatic language for something very simple. Ottawa is gaming out a second Trump term and building firewalls against it. Trump's allies, especially in the right-wing media, didn't like hearing that. They rushed to the cameras to accuse Canada of meddling in U.S. politics, as if Canada doesn't have the right to plan for its own security. But note what Canada actually did. They didn't weigh in on who Americans should vote for. They didn't tell U.S. citizens how to cast their ballots. What they did say was, whoever sits in the Oval Office, Canada is going to be ready. That's the first part of the dagger. Canada is refusing to pretend that Trump is just another normal Republican president. They are putting it on the record, calmly, methodically, that they see real risk in a MAGA return, and they're building policy around that risk. The second part of the dagger is economic. Trump's whole approach to allies is built on leverage. He believes that because the U.S. market is so large, countries like Canada will ultimately swallow whatever he dishes out. Tariffs, insults, threats, just to keep access to American consumers. What Canada has quietly been doing for years now is reducing that leverage. Look at the trade architecture. Canada has a major trade agreement with the European Union, CETA, which has opened up huge opportunities for Canadian exporters in Europe. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, a high-standard trade pact with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and several other Pacific economies, a pact the Trump administration walked away from. A growing suite of agreements and memoranda with countries in the Indo-Pacific focused on critical minerals, clean technology, and diversified supply chains. Put those pieces together, and you see the picture. Canada is not walking away from the United States, so that would be impossible and foolish, given how integrated the two economies are. But Canada is giving itself options. If Trump were to come back and, for example, suddenly announce new tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, or agriculture, Ottawa is in a better position than it was in 2016 to pivot more exports toward Europe and Asia. And it's not just about trade volumes, it's about strategic sectors. Canada has some of the most important critical mineral reserves in the democratic world. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth elements, the stuff you need for electric vehicles, batteries, and high-tech manufacturing. Over the last few years, Canada has signed critical mineral partnerships with the European Union, with Japan, with South Korea, and it has deepened coordination with allies to create supply chains that are less dependent on China and, crucially, less vulnerable to political tantrums in Washington. That is long-term structural pushback. Trump's instinct is to pick up the tariff weapon and swing it wildly. Canada's response is to carefully rearrange the global chessboard so that if he swings again, he hits a lot more air and a lot less Canadian vulnerability. From the outside, it may not look dramatic. It doesn't fit in a tweet. But from the perspective of economic power, this is a direct hit. It reduces Trump's ability to credibly threaten Canada without also damaging U.S. standing in a much broader network of allied supply chains that Ottawa has helped build. The third front is political and informational. One of the most important and under-discussed stories of the last few years is how deeply the U.S. far right has tried to export its culture war into Canada. You saw it during the so-called Freedom Convoy in 2022. What started as a protest by some truck drivers against vaccine mandates turned into an occupation of downtown Ottawa and multiple border crossings being blocked. Investigations later showed a significant chunk of the online donations came from outside Canada, including from the United States. U.S. right-wing media amplified and glorified the protests, and prominent American figures, from media personalities to politicians, were cheering on a movement that was directly undermining Canadian public order. That was not an accident. It fit a broader MAGA narrative that casts any government trying to enforce basic public health rules, climate policy, or inclusive education as tyrannical, even if that government is democratically elected and operating under the rule of law. At the same time, some provincial politicians in Canada, particularly on the conservative right, started to adopt MAGA-style rhetoric. You have leaders talking about sovereignty acts, promising to ignore federal laws they don't like, flirting with separatist language, attacking independent institutions, and trying to turn every policy disagreement with Ottawa into an existential cultural war. In short, some Canadian actors are trying to import the Trump playbook north of the border. And this is where the response from the federal level and from Canadian civil society becomes critical. We've seen parliamentary committees looking into foreign funding of domestic protests and disinformation campaigns, new laws and proposals aimed at increasing transparency around online platforms, foreign interference, and political advertising, and a very deliberate effort by mainstream Canadian parties to draw a line between legitimate conservative or progressive debate and U.S.-style extremism that seeks to delegitimize the entire democratic system. Is every step perfect? No. There are real debates inside Canada about how you regulate online speech while protecting free expression. There are real disagreements about how far to go in policing foreign influence, but the overall direction is clear. Canada is trying to inoculate itself against MAGA-style radicalization. The message is, have your arguments, hold your elections, swap governments in and out. That's democracy. But don't import a model that says, if my side loses, the system must be rigged, or that treats institutions like the courts, the media, and independent agencies as enemies of the people. For Trump, whose movement relies heavily on exporting grievance politics and amplifying chaos abroad, that's a problem. When a neighboring democracy builds up defenses against your narrative weapons, it weakens your ability to shape the environment beyond your borders. That's another piece of the dagger. Now, there's one more element that has Trump's world nervous, and it's not about any single policy. It's about leadership and narrative. For years, Trump has tried to position himself as the voice of a global nationalist uprising. He wants to be the reference point for hard-right movements from Brazil to Hungary to Canada. What we're seeing from Canada is a very different claim, that you can be a serious, modern, democratic country committed to the rule of law, diversity, and international cooperation, and still be tough, still defend your interests, and still grow your economy. You hear that from Justin Trudeau, yes. But you also hear it from figures across the Canadian political and economic elite, including people like former central bank governor Mark Carney. Carney, who has run both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, has warned repeatedly about the dangers of what he calls market fundamentalism and unhinged populism. He has argued that leaders who deny climate science, attack institutions, and wage culture wars are ultimately sabotaging their own economies. He's not the only one making that case. Senior Canadian officials, diplomats, and business leaders have been showing up at places like the World Economic Forum, the Munich Security Conference, G7 meetings, and laying out an alternative path, one that says democracies can coordinate, can invest in clean energy, can regulate big tech, can protect workers, without collapsing into chaos or authoritarianism. In other words, you don't have to choose between prosperity and democracy. You can have both. And you don't need Trump's brand of politics to get there. Every time a Canadian leader stands on a world stage and calmly dismantles the MAGA narrative, it undercuts Trump's claim to be the inevitable future of Western politics. You can see why that enrages him and his allies, because if other countries, especially another G7 country right on the U.S. border, can show that a very different model works, then the Trump project looks less like a historic wave and more like a radical detour that democracies can and should avoid. So where does that leave us? On the surface, relations between Canada and the United States remain deeply intertwined. Trade continues, joint exercises continue, intelligence sharing continues. On many issues, especially under the current U.S. administration, cooperation is strong. But underneath, there is a hard recalculation going on in Ottawa. Canadian officials are planning for potential Trump-era tariffs, building backup trade routes and supply chains, hardening their political system against foreign-driven disinformation, and stepping into a more visible leadership role among mid-sized democracies. That's not bluster. That's not a hashtag. That is the methodical response of a country that has looked at the chaos of the past few years, looked at Trump's promises for a second term, and decided, never again will we be caught off guard. And if Trump and his inner circle are paying attention, they should see this for what it is. Canada is not trying to pick a fight with the American people. Canadians and Americans are deeply connected. Families, businesses, culture, defense. That relationship is bigger than any one politician. But Canada is absolutely willing to confront Trumpism. It is willing to call it out for what it is, a threat to Allied security, to the rules-based international order, and to the basic norms that have held this continent together for generations. So when you hear Canadian ministers talk about preparing for the worst-case scenario, when you see Ottawa deepen trade with Europe and Asia, when you see Canadian leaders stand up on global stages and argue for a different kind of politics, understand that's not theater. That is a sovereign country putting limits on how far a future Trump White House can push them. And in geopolitical terms, that is a dagger. Whether Trump likes it or not, Canada is not going to be a silent neighbor while he tries to drag the democratic world into another spiral of chaos. Canada is signaling calmly, firmly, and repeatedly that if he comes back to power, he will be facing a very different northern neighbor than the one he bullied in 2018. One that has learned, adapted, and is now ready to hit back where it really matters. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown helpful and you want more deep dive coverage on how democracies are pushing back against Trumpism and authoritarian movements around the world, make sure you subscribe, hit the notifications, and I'll see you in the next video.